All right, so we know that we have the main thread that we have in our application inside of our main.m file. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of show you how this works and the fact that you can, in fact, make normal C style or Objective-C style processes, you know, pretty much in any function you want. So what we're going to do is in the main function, I want to actually define some variables that, you know, maybe we set up for the application to use, or, you know, in this case, we're just playing. Now, we do have access to primitive types. Those are int, char, you know, the typical C variable types that you would have. But then you also have Objective-C types as well, and Objective-C types are actually objects. They're actually, you can think of them as, each of them as being a class. Now, all objects inherit from the base object of NSObject, which is the lowest level that you can you know, be. You can't be anything. Everything inherits from that class. The other thing is that Objective-C does not have the concept of multiple inheritance like you get in C++. That is one of the most controversial things about C++, and one that, you know, I don't really get either. So I would suggest not really worrying about that. But in Objective-C, you don't really have the concept of being able to inherit from multiple classes at the same time. So how do we declare a variable that is actually an Objective-C style variable? So let's declare what Objective-C refers to as an NS mutable array, and it actually is a good example of inheritance. We actually have an NS array, which is a class that is, you can't change. Once you set up whatever is going to be in that array, you can't change the values that are in the array. An NS mutable array actually has the ability to change the values, or to add values or delete values out of the array. So it's more what I would say is a dynamic array. So let's see how you actually would create that. Well, just like in C, we give it the type. Now, one of the things that I'll say is, if you're going to program in Objective-C, you almost have to have Xcode or some similar application, because without these pop-ups, you're going to have a really difficult time trying to remember what all of the different types are in the application or in the programming language, because it really gets kind of crazy. So we're going to declare an NS mutable array, and I'm just hitting the enter key once that thing pops up on what I'm looking for. We're going to do a space, and now we're going to actually give it the name of whatever it is that we want to call this. Now, it has to be a pointer, so we'll just call this items. So right now we have our variable type, and then we have what we're going to call the variable. Now, this declares the variable, but it doesn't actually create an instance of that object, because remember, we have variable types, but in the case of a class, we have to actually create an instance of that class to be able to work with it. So we could do this on separate lines. I'm just going to go ahead and do it on one line. So we're going to say that this equals, and now is where we actually get into some Objective-C looking code. We're going to put two open brackets, and you'll understand why two in just a second. We're going to tell it that we are creating an NS mutable array. Now, all NS objects that you have, they all come with two primary, or really three primary class or functions that you can call. You have alloc, which is an allocate. You have init, which is an initialization, and then you have a description, which will actually give you information about that particular object. So in this case, we want to actually create the object. So the first thing we need to do is allocate memory to that object, and that's our first square bracket. Now, we could, on a separate line, then turn around and do an initialization on it. The initialization is called init, and it is basically going out and initializing all of the variables. So the alloc goes out and creates the memory we need. The init goes out and actually initializes everything so that we can actually start using it. Every single object that you create inside of Objective-C is going to have this syntax for creating the object. In Java, in some of the other videos, I showed how to create an object inside of Java. It's much simpler, but this is the way you do it in Objective-C. So you're going to have to go out and create these square brackets and do an allocate, and then pass the allocate off to an init, and then that returns back and gives you your items. Now, Objective-C is giving me a warning here on this particular line. If I want to see what that warning is, I can come up here and click on the warnings icon here, and it will tell me that I've got an unused entity because I've declared this variable, but I haven't actually used it yet. So we'll go back over to here. So now we have a variable called items, and we want to actually do something with it. Well, a common thing that we might want to do is to add an element to that particular array. So let's do that. Well, again, in Objective-C, we have to do everything through functions and method calls and stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to have our square bracket. We're going to give it the name of the item that we're the object that we want to work with. So in this case, we call this items. So that's our object that we're going to work with. Well, items is a type NS Mutable Array, and the NS Mutable Array actually has some methods that I can call to work with that particular type of variable or that particular type of object. One of them is add object. So we're going to come in and we're going to type in add object. I'm going to hit enter. And then it wants to know, what do you want to put in there? So I'm going to, and I'll explain this in 1 second, I'm going to put in 1. And then we're going to close our function and semicolon. Now, what in the world did I just do? What we did is we have our object items. We have our method name. In C, it would be called a function. In Objective-C, they call it a method. We have our method add object, and then we're telling it to put a 1 in that position. Now, what is the @ sign? The @ sign is an Objective-C thing, and it actually gives me the ability to create a string on the fly without actually declaring the string. So if you see an @ it is just literally letting me go out and create a string right now and not have to worry about declaring it or anything like that. It actually does all that declaration and stuff for you. So it's kind of cool, kind of strange, but kind of cool. And so anyway, that gets us an item in there. Well, let's do that again. Let's come in here and say that we're going to work with items. We're going to add another object, and we're going to set a 2. So now we've got an object that has 2 variables. We'll do it again, except this time I want to call a different method. So we're going to tell it to insert an object. This time, if you notice, the insert actually has 2 variables. So now, remember earlier I was explaining to you exactly what this looked like when we were working with it. Well, now you can actually see it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to declare that we want to put in a variable called 3. And the next thing is our second parameter. And again, this is a little strange. These are technically 2 variables that we're working with. And if you think about it, if you really think about it, Objective-C isn't really using functions. It's just declaring variables, and it figures out what to call based on what variables you're calling. So if you think about this being a variable and this being a variable, it might help you a little bit understanding what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Well, what I want to do here is we're supposed to pass in an integer, so I'm just going to tell it to put it at position 1 inside of the function, or inside of the array, and then we're going to end our function call and put our semicolon on the end of the line. All lines have to have semicolons. So just to recap here, we're working with items. This is a different function call. This is called insert object, and again, I would try to think about this as a variable. It kind of makes it a little bit less painful. So we have a variable called insert object that we're going to pass 3. This is a character, a constant string that we're creating here on the fly. And then we're going to tell it to create that string at index 1. So at index is another variable that happens to be on the function declaration for this particular thing, and we're going to pass it a 1. So colons separate the method name or the the variable name or whatever you want to call this thing from the actual value. And then, in this case, we've got two values getting passed in, or two methods that are being called. Now, in Objective-C, just to be clear, Objective-C, when you compile this thing, is actually making a C application. So what it ends up doing is creating this link table that is basically going in and saying, well, now wait, they're calling this item, which is an NS mutable array, and they're calling something called insert object and passing it this, and they're also calling at index and passing it this. So I need to go find a function that is taking these two parameters, and that's the function that we're going to actually call. So it's kind of a complex bunch of stuff going on the back end to make this work, which again is kind of mind-boggling to me. But in any case, it's the way it goes. So right now we have our array, and so let's end this video on actually creating this object. We've made a couple function calls so you can kind of see how that works. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to actually do a for loop to loop through this thing and actually print out the values that are in this particular array.